long as there's not a trampoline, it's okay.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you.
That too is par for the course.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. It is indeed a great pleasure to have you with us at the GrowthNet Summit, today co-convened by Ananta Center, the CII, Smadja and Smadja Strategic Advisory. This is the 7th annual meeting of the GrowthNet. GrowthNet, since its inception in 2013, has grown over the years and emerged as a platform to connect with entrepreneurial and technological dynamism of emerging economies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor and privilege to welcome in our midst today our Chief Inaugural Speaker, Dr. S. JAISHANKAR, External Affairs Minister of India. Hardly it's been a week since the Honorable Minister has taken oath in office, and truly it is an icing on the cake of a very, very distinguished career. A diplomat who has served, rarely do you find such distinguished people who have served both in the leadership roles in China and in US, and then as Foreign Secretary. He's had a very, very important role to play in the outreach that Prime Minister Modi did in his first term, connecting with the world leaders across. And now we have him as our External Affairs Minister. So it's indeed an inspired choice of this government, and congratulations very much for your taking over, and thank you for being with us. A very warm welcome to Mr. JAMSHYD Godrej, our Chairman of the Ananta Center and past President of CII, and Chairman Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company Limited. Welcome to Mr. Claude Smadja, founder and Chairman of Smadja and Smadja. This summit is partnered by him, and this would have not been possible without his support and guidance. A very, very warm welcome to all our international participants who are gathered in large numbers. We are very thankful to you for having traveled long distances to be with us here today. The summit has grown over the years and emerged as a platform for stakeholders and leaders of today's emerging and developing economies to address challenges facing their business, economy, and trade. We meet to exchange ideas and information and to build mutual trust that will shape the future and to develop a joint agenda for future cooperation. The theme for the summit this year is innovating our ways amidst structural disruptions. Innovation is necessity of these times of rapid transformation, and we have these issues in every sector, be it finance, infrastructure, trade, healthcare, communication, skill development, digitization, etc. This year we have more than 50 speakers from around the world, including businesses, political leaders, ministers, senior government officials, eminent media personalities, renowned economists and thought leaders, heads of think tanks, amongst others. We shall endeavor to engage in strong deliberations over the next 2 days and address the most compelling challenges that we face. The summit is being held at the most opportune time. It's just been a few days since the people of India have voted their Prime Minister, and Mr. Modi is back with a historic mandate. This unprecedented mandate reflects the optimism of a country looking forward to an economic upsurge and more prosperity to its people. The Indian economy's potential for growth is massive, and we expect the government to leverage the entirety of its potential and herald a new and exciting era. Last but not the least, let me extend my special thanks to all the corporate sponsors, to Godrej, to Tata Sons, to Indian Metals and Ferroalloys, to Covington, Exim Bank, Ambuja Neotia Group. We really appreciate your contribution. With these few words, I welcome you once again and thank you for your participation. May I now request Mr. Godrej to deliver his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Harsh, and a very warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. And we are particularly pleased this morning to have Dr. JAISHANKAR with us. As you know, he is our Minister for External Affairs, and he will be here with us to inaugurate this 7th Annual GrowthNet Summit. As we have clearly seen, and as Harsh has mentioned, the Prime Minister and the Bharatiya Janata Party have received a very resounding response from the people of India. And I think to a very large extent, it is due to our economic relations around the world. And I'm sure that over the next 5 years, we will also see much more of that. I think economic external relations is a has been a keynote and a keystone for the Prime Minister. And we are very pleased that he has selected Dr. JAISHANKAR to carry this message and this mandate around the world. We were together just a few days ago in Japan, and we had the opportunity at that time to meet with the Prime Minister. And I must say that the work that has been done by this government, the Prime Minister and JAISHANKAR earlier as Foreign Secretary, is something that has really resounded in the region. So thank you, Jai, for being with us here to inaugurate GrowthNet. And not just congratulations, but we are very sure that your tenure will be extremely successful in promoting, in a complex world and a complex environment, the issues of not just foreign relations, but economic relations. And I always want to add that the cornerstone to all this should be good environment and sustainable policy, for not just for India, but for the region and the world. As you know, Dr. JAISHANKAR is the first career diplomat to be appointed as the Minister for External Affairs.
Second, Natwar Singh.
Second.
Natwar Singh.
Natwar Singh, okay. So you're the second, okay. And he has, of course, served with great distinction as our ambassador in the USA, and he's been our longest serving ambassador in China. And so, of course, we are delighted to have such experienced hands lead the foreign ministry. Ananta Center and CII have been privileged to be associated with Dr. JAISHANKAR over the years and have benefited immensely from his invaluable insights and his understanding of the intricacies of global affairs has enriched numerous strategic dialogues and international platforms where he has joined us. We are, of course, honored to have you here this morning for your first public engagement. And I would now request Harsh to moderate the discussion that we would be having this morning.
Yes. Thank you, JAMSHYD. Kiran has moved away the podium, so we have no choice but to engage in an interaction. Sir, we can't allow you to give a speech because there's no podium. So if you permit, we will just straight go into interaction. So would you like to kick it off, Mr. Godrej?
Thank you, Harsh. Couple of questions for you, Dr. Jaishankar. As you know, the title of this session is Changing World, Changing India. In your view, what are the key changes and how do they relate to each other?
Okay, before I respond to the question, first of all, let me say I'm really very pleased to be here. Till a few days ago, first of all, I've had a long association with GrowthNet. This is not the first GrowthNet I have attended or spoken at, and I've seen it grow, and I'm really very happy at its progress. In fact, till a few days ago, I was part of Mr. Neotia's executive committee to organize this event. And we were discussing that its timing was perfect because it would happen just after the election. And then we'll go and find a minister to come and speak here. So I must confess, I never dreamt that I'd be the minister in question. But nevertheless, it's good to see you all. Let's start with the topic, changing world, changing India. I think the world is really today it's always a changing world, okay? But the question is, if the changes are very sharp, very discontinuous, very much more complex than they have been in the past, and if they've gone in directions which we have broadly and collectively not anticipated, then I think that those changes are much harder to adjust to and to predicate your businesses on. So today, if one looks at what those changes are, clearly, I think the most obvious one is that globalization is under stress. Many of the assumptions of globalization, which is global supply chains, mobility of talent, market access in different ways. I think all those are no longer assumptions we can make to the same degree with the same extent of confidence. I'm not saying that any of these are gone. I don't think we should over-dramatize it, but I think we need to understand the seriousness of what those changes are. The second change, I would say, is across the world, actually, and the reasons are very complex. Every society is different, every region is different. You've had actually, I would say broadly, a growth of nationalism. And that nationalism has been validated electorally in many places. At one level, each is different, but somewhere there is a message out there. The third change, I would say, which is actually a much longer term change, is sort of a global rebalancing. The sharpest sort of manifestation of that is the rise of China. To some extent, the rise of India as well. But overall, if you look at it in a sort of, say, a 20-year time frame, it's very clear that the relative weights of global economies are changing. And the three are connected because in many, if you look, when I spoke about nationalism, the nationalism in Asia, for example, is a nationalism of confidence. These are of societies who are finding that year on year the prospects have improved. They feel that their views, their cultures, their concepts now need to get a fairer hearing than they did in the past. But there are nationalisms in other places which are actually nationalisms of insecurity, or nationalisms which are from a sense that there is stagnation, that there is quality of life hasn't improved. So the global balancing, in a sense, is driving the nationalism. The nationalism is driving the stress on globalization. So I would say the global picture, therefore, is very much more complicated than it was 5 years ago. I think for a foreign minister of any country, leave alone a big country, I think navigating the world is a much more complex exercise. So to be very honest, I see that as a big challenge. Now, as for changing India, I think the short answer would be just look at the election results. I mean, people have analyzed what it's about, and it's very clear that a lot of the programs and efforts at giving hope, bringing change and giving hope to people at the lowest income level of this society has had a very profound impact. But at the same time, it's also, I think, if you look at younger demographics, you look at more aspirational expectations, I think those have also been met. So, I don't think there's a simple answer for the electoral verdict. But I think if there is one, if you ask me, so what was your big takeaway from the election? My takeaway would be that the 5 years of change, the 5 years of government actually has kept alive and perhaps even strengthened the expectation of change in this country.
So just to follow up on what you just said, clearly, as we've been discussing, the government, especially this government, this Prime Minister came back with a resounding majority. And so what role do you think that foreign policy, and especially foreign economic policy, played in that?
Well, let me look at the foreign policy briefly before I come to the economic policy. I think, again, my sense, you are free to differ if you wish. My sense is that the large majority of people in this country recognize that India's standing in the world has gone up, and more important, that this is something that matters to them. I think the assumption that somehow, the masses don't care about what the world thinks about us is not true. So that sense that today, the country is on the move, that the world looks at us very differently, and there are consequences to that. That means different expectations, different responsibilities. I think that is something where foreign policy has made a difference, particularly in the last 5 years. The second, kind of related to that, is in the security sphere. Again, I think one of the takeaways would be that clearly the vote of confidence is also a vote of confidence in the ability to manage national security. And foreign policy is integral to that, because you have to, you are an enabler in many ways, you are an explainer in many ways of what has happened. But to come back to your key question, what does it mean in economic terms? I think today, the obvious one is, if we are looking at an ambitious scale of change, then the Indian model of growth, of development, is actually to grow with the world. And we need to forge different partnerships with different regions. These will be partnerships where it may be directly related to, say, a flagship campaign like Skill India or Namami Gange or something like that. Or it could be a larger, business collaboration, technology inflows, capital inflows. And bear in mind, today, the Indian economy is not within India. A very large part of the Indian economy is also externalizing. So it would mean, fairer access to markets, negotiating conditions, better conditions for trade. So I think there is today, if we want to propel economic change, I think there is a greater responsibility for Indian foreign policy today to focus on the external aspects of it, to create partnerships which would help within India, but also to create partnerships and, shall I say, arrangements, mechanisms which would help Indian businesses to secure markets and, do their businesses outside India as well. And somewhere I would say, there is a very strong interplay today between the economics and the politics. I mean, certainly if you look at our region, there is a clear need for more regional economics, more regional connectivity. I think these are also areas where foreign policy can make a big difference.
Thank you. Harsh?
Mr. Claude, would you like to?
Thank you. I would like just to follow up on. It works? I just would like, Mr. Minister, to follow up on what you just said about the interplay between economics and politics. As we know, in between your positions as a veteran diplomat, you have been involved in the private sector. And it would be interesting to hear from you if there have been anything that you have learned or which has a little bit added to your thinking during this time where you were involved with the private sector at the top level with a group which is truly a global group.
Okay. Well, look, I would say the first thing I learned is that the government looks very different from outside than it did from inside. And you can take that remark whichever way you wish to. But seriously, look, I think when it comes to decision making, typically in government, because the decisions have a certain sort of larger implications, you tend to be much more deliberative about that decision. Okay, you'd rather get it right, even if it takes longer, than to get it wrong. When you inhabit the business world, I think there are other pressures on you. There are pressures of time, and time is money, and often optimal decision. I mean, there the perfect is often the enemy of the good. So your mindset to some degree is different, you know. And I think there's much truth in both. You know, the question is how to harmonize it. I mean, I can certainly say by the year out that I had out of government, it really taught me a lot. There were a whole set of issues where, there were things I didn't even know. I mean, I'm not even talking of improving, on my knowledge base. So it certainly made me much more sensitive. For example, one big responsibility today that we have in the foreign ministry is of project execution. Okay, we have lines of credit, we have grants, and project execution has a larger foreign policy, almost strategic significance, because it is only through those projects and the connectivity and the closeness that grows with that we can actually build a larger, closer region. Now, I'm pretty sure that I used to monitor and oversee that earlier in a different capacity. But I'm pretty sure after a year out in business, I'd be looking at the same things, but with a slightly different perspective, and I suspect a slightly smarter perspective.
Thank you. If you look at the world today, and when you look at what is happening with respect, for instance, to the US-China relationship, we see many instances where politics trumps economics. We see also instances where economics trumps politics. And so the relationship between these two domains is becoming more and more intertwined. When you look at the national policy of a country, we realize that today, if you don't have this kind of very close integration between economic domains, policy domains, security domains, in fact, you put yourself in a weakened position. What do you see as a way for the Indian government in this new configuration that we face today in your country to really be able to integrate much more these different components so that you would have, India would have, in a way, getting more buck for the bank, if you want. Because on many occasions, at least as a foreign observer, I have seen, but this is not only in India, but in many countries, a kind of silo approach to some problems. How do you look at the way to, in a way, break up the silos and having this kind of coherent, integrated approach to global economic or political issues?
I discovered that actually silos is not a government problem, it's an organizational problem. Okay? No, I mean it in the sense that any large organization, even a private sector, I mean, if you have a large private conglomerate of multiple companies, you're going to have silos. Okay? So in that sense, look at the government as a large organization. I mean, forget for the fact that it's a government. I think in any sort of the management of any large organization, I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with that, a lot of your efficiencies are actually dependent on integration, on that ability to sort of break through the silos. And breaking through the silos is probably one of the things which sounds very easy to do. It's probably the most difficult thing to do. Okay. And I mean, in my last job, I kind of made a living out of it. Okay. So the issue will be that I mean, it's not just operational. I think you have to conceptually, somewhere there have got to be meeting points at the top, at the middle, at the upper middle, at the lower middle. If you don't have multiple laterals, a single lateral at the top and a single lateral at the bottom will not do. It doesn't work. It doesn't actually happen. And I completely accept, I mean, this is today a challenge. And picking up on your other observation, in fact, I would put it slightly differently. I would say today, in that kind of world that I described where globalization is under stress, there's more nationalism, I would say the line between politics and economics has actually got very thin to the point of vanishing. When a country invokes tariffs on national security basis, that line's pretty much gone. Okay. So the point I would make is, look, the world is what it is. I mean, we can argue whether we like it or we don't like it, but we got to take it. I mean, we got to operate in it while you may wish to change it while it's going on. So given the state of the world, I mean, to me, the need certainly within the Indian system to operate exactly as you said, to get more bang for the buck, the key to that is much tighter integration, much more, a much better ability of different departments and ministries to work together. And I think, frankly, in this government from day one, from the first cabinet meeting, that was the message of the Prime Minister. And I've been a minister less than a week, but I've probably spent more time with the finance minister and the commerce minister in the last 1 week than I may have even spent in my own ministry. So I think there is a recognition of that. I mean, the 1 week's experience that I've had, I think there is a very strong inclination for departments to gravitate, and the ministers need to lead. Look, if my ministry sees me working with finance ministry on their issues, with commerce ministry on their issues, and then I convince them they are not their issues, they are our issues. That transition has to happen. Now, I don't think people would disagree with it conceptually, but with every shall I say, authority comes the concept of turf. You know, I mean, turf is what it's about. I mean, you know, we used to many years ago watch this series called Yes Minister. I mean, it was all about turf. So how do you get over that sense of protecting your turf and, you know, sort of yielding, or I would say getting over that sense that it's something you're giving away. You know, that's really the mindset change. And I think if the minister set an example, I'm pretty sure that it would have an impact down the line.
Thank you.
Sir, just as a follow-up to what Mr. Claude said, on one side we see a world getting increasingly interconnected, be it in telecommunications, air connectivity, and general attitude of people to sort of be more interconnected. On the other side, we see tariff barriers coming in, we see more nationalism, we see, what is your perspective on the worldview of these two very contradictory phenomena that is both gathering pace at the same time?
I think that's part of that complication I was telling you about. Because if you look, say, today at the economic domain, I'm talking trade but bigger than trade. I mean, on the one hand, you have a regime like the WTO. Okay. Now, like any regime, there can be shortcomings, but you know, you really don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I think if somebody says, okay, there's a strong case for improvement, that's completely legitimate. But I think if things aren't working well in the eyes of some nations or many nations, the solution is to fix it, so not to break it. But the reality is also, while all of that may be happening, many countries are sliding into free trade agreements. Okay, that's also a reality. So, but now you have also the prospect that many countries are looking at bilateral arrangements. That too is a reality. So I think this much more complex world that I keep talking about, I mean, if you look in sort of economic, in terms of trade, services, investments, etc., you will have a global overarching sort of system. You will have regional systems. You will have bilateral arrangements. You will have unstructured arrangements. And these multiple realities will exist. And I think the smart countries are those who have developed that ability to engage each one. I mean, it's like foreign policy. I mean, if you have multiple power centers, you don't engage one to the exclusion of the other, because the moment you do that, you actually weaken your own hand. So just like you engage multiple countries, you engage multiple levels of regimes or realities at the same time. Now, again, it's not easy to do, because you know, all of us have habits. We have you know, sort of done business a certain way. We have developed convictions which come out of it. So you know, in a sense, to go back to what Claude said, I mean, the big challenge is to get it, you know, to kind of introduce, to change the ability to sort of understand the new reality, to then introduce changes in your approach, and then see how you get better outcomes.
So the other thing, just as a furtherance of this idea, is South Asia to me appears to be one of the less interconnected regions of the world. How do you see India playing a pivotal role, particularly being the largest economy in this region, to actually help in this interconnectedness or integration?
You know, I think this is a subject to which a lot of attention was given in the last 5 years. And I'm very, very confident, frankly, that this would be among our top priority for the next 5 years. And it will be a priority for this region. I mean, I think you were very kind when you said that this is among the less connected regions. I mean, I think if you look around the world, it's probably among the least connected regions. And there are reasons for it. There are reasons of history, there are reasons of identity. Now, to my mind, the first sort of development which can bring about the change, I think that's already happening, is for the countries themselves to realize that they are losing out, all of them, by not being connected enough. Okay. If their leaderships come to that realization and their systems come to that realization, then I think you would have people start making those moves. Now, I would say by and large, most South Asian countries today understand that. I think that it's very different from where it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, certainly when SAARC was founded. The next challenge would be how do you then make it work? There I agree with you. I think the primary responsibility is on India. Because we are the largest economy, and in that sense our growth can serve as a sort of lifting tide for all our neighbors. Now, if that happens, then to my mind, or if that were to happen, then to my mind, I don't think we should over negotiate that. I think if you want it to happen, look, the benefits will come. So we need to incentivize cooperation in the neighborhood by often stepping out ourselves. I would say, the one thing I would in this domain not like to see is this feeling that somehow it has to be reciprocal. It cannot be reciprocal by the very fact that we have more resources and a much greater capability, and in many ways a larger interest in making it happen. So I would really expect to see, and from my side try to make to see, a sort of a generous policy where we take the lead. We have already substantial lines of credit. We have programs of grant assistance to many of our neighbors. We have a lot of their livelihood derives from economic activities in India. And if you look, say at a country like Bangladesh today, in the old days we would normally point to Bhutan as a country which has actually leveraged its relationship with India brilliantly. This is a country which has actually made its location and its resources into an enormous economic asset. But today, if I were to point to the change, I would, for example, cite Bangladesh and look at the change of attitudes in Bangladesh, look at the positivity out there, look at the appetite for more interactions with India. And the moment you get past the sort of the mind blocks, then even issues like connectivity will open up. If say the inland waterways of Bangladesh become more commercially viable, if you see more ports out there, we've always thought of Act East as through Myanmar. Now suddenly you get a completely another axis for moving eastwards. So the emphasis which the government is today putting on BIMSTEC is, a lot of the thinking is centered around that. Now, the sort of the thinking really is where any organization or any platform which allows you to progress, you would like to use it to progress. Now, SAARC has certain problems. I think we all know what it is. So, even if you were to put the terrorism issue aside, there are connectivity issues, there are trade issues out there. What we are doing in a way, if you look, why were the BIMSTEC leaders invited for the swearing in? Because I think we see today an energy in BIMSTEC and a possibility in BIMSTEC and a mindset in BIMSTEC, which fits in with that very, sort of optimistic vision of economic cooperation that I'm laying before you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Godrej, would you like to, or Mr. Claude?
Yeah, thank you, Harsh. Dr. JAISHANKAR, you mentioned earlier about project capability, that we are funding projects abroad, and that many of these have their own issues or difficulties in order to be able to execute them. You also mentioned that the private sector also has challenges in project execution, etc. How would what would you think is the sort of because India's sort of track record on project capability, which is what you mentioned, it has a effect on foreign relations, and what is it that we can, I mean, how bad is it or how good is it? Or I'm sure there are examples of both, and how do you think we could actually do something to change that trajectory?
This frankly is a slightly awkward question, because I don't want to appear critical. I'm trying to walk that fine line, being realistic and being critical. Okay. Honestly, if you ask me, I don't want to say a record was good or bad, but if you ask me, is there scope for improvement, I would say enormous. And why, I would ask this question based on my own experience in the last 3 years. Where is it we came up short? Okay. We came up short in a number of areas. And again, this is not a general universal explanation. There will be some areas where one explanation applies. For example, if you were to look at our African projects, I think we came up short because there were areas, we didn't have the right tools to conceptualize the projects. So often these were left to much smaller enterprises who didn't have the bandwidth to really bridge the government, the Indian system with the countries where you are doing the projects. And there, I think we've tried to fix it by actually devising a very much more effective pre-qualification system, so that if you were to do big projects, rather than have it as a purely L1 driven exercise, you have actually you have to give weightage to experience, you have to give weightage to capability, because that is how you will actually get the outcome. If I were to award a project completely to an untested or a small enterprise which does not have the capacity, which will then look for other partners, then I get a suboptimal outcome. So I think in the last few years we have spent a lot of time reviewing that kind of problem, which is first of all, who are your partners in executing these projects, which are the businesses which should be in it. And my sense is that underbrush has been clear, that we have actually made progress, that when you look at the projects now in the pipeline, you will get a much there will be companies with a much stronger record who are actually executing that. The second is actually the predictability of financing, because we have an annual budget exercise, and an annual budget exercise, finally you kind of ration out your resources, and then somewhere you come up short, somewhere you don't. So in 2014, 2015, actually the government decided that for big projects there would be, in practical terms, a sort of assured financing, so that even at the beginning, it's not like you do 3 years and then you run out of it 4th year and then take a break. So I think that's one improvement which actually has been where the finance ministry has been very positive and understanding of that. The third is actually project monitoring, and here one of the innovations which Mr. Modi brought about was something called Pragati, where he would once a month there would be a list of projects which would be sort of pre-selected, and then all the players would be on the screen, and then he would kind of conduct that review. And now sometimes foreign projects were selected, so I participated in it from the receiving end, you might say. Now that's an example. I told the Prime Minister I would like to implement now 4 foreign projects within the foreign ministry, that I would like, once or maybe twice a month to actually do regular reviews of projects. Because look, the moment people feel someone up there is taking interest, is asking you the tough questions, is holding people responsible for what happens or what doesn't happen, then I think they themselves, the system's response then starts to change. And in all of this, again we go back to Claude's question of that coordination. If to the extent we can get into the foreign ministry a better sense of project management or financial management, but you can get into the finance ministry or the the line ministries, the roads, a sense of strategy, a sense of why that is important. So that cross fertilization I think will create a mindset, and some of it is also physical exchange of people. I mean, one of the positive developments in the foreign ministry is the fact that today we have engineers or technical staff whom we have taken on deputation, and I'd like to see that grow.
Claude, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Minister, allow me to go to a different domain. You have been mentioning that the profile and standing of India on the international scene has been rising, and quite frankly, I think it is a most welcome development, a very, very positive development. At the same time, we know that India has to follow its own diplomacy, its own strategic interest. It has, of course, a vision of its role on the international scene. But when you have 2 economic giants, the 2 most important single economy in the world, clashing, no country, no other country can avoid the risk of being squeezed by this confrontation, whatever its size, whatever its own diplomatic objectives. Now, as you said, this creates a much more complicated world, and I suspect a much more complicated task for you as the leader of India's foreign policy. Now, Kissinger once said, wanting to have diplomacy without military might is like wanting to play the music without the instruments. And this applies also today to economic might. So to what extent your efficiency as India's chief diplomat, as the person in charge of standing for India's strategic interest in the world, to what extent your efficiency and the success of your task will be dependent of India increasing its military and security stance, and at the same time accelerating significantly its economic growth?
Well, frankly, in every clash, there's an opportunity. So there are risks also, I don't deny that. And obviously, my job would be to manage the risks and maximize the opportunity. Now, again, as I said, today diplomacy is at multiple levels. Looking out for yourself is not incompatible with doing global good or supporting a global order. I don't think it's an either or. And at the end of the day, let's be frank, all of us do look out for ourselves.
Of course.
So I think when today we survey the landscape, and I am very cognizant of some of the friction points that you have pointed out. I think we need to see where we are, where where our interests are involved. If there is now, I mean, I'm sort of repeating to you a conversation I probably had on the same location with David Petraeus at the beginning of the year, and David Petraeus said, there's a US-China friction, so you got to choose sides. So I said, yes, sure, we've chosen side. I've chosen my side. So the point is, look, for big countries like India with a strong tradition of independence, we have always navigated the world. I mean, with that sense of, frankly, getting optimal outcomes of a difficult landscape. Now I grant you the landscape has become more complicated, which just means it calls on us to raise our game. But we still have to do that in a way in which we come out ahead. I respect Dr. Kissinger's observation, but again I would say if you look at the state of the world today, the world is much more interdependent despite the pressures on stress on globalization. There are constraints on a lot of things which could have been done in the 60s and 70s and 80s simply cannot be done today. Okay. The costs are too great for many countries. So national security is important. I think today one of the messages of the election is that they trust the government to do what it takes to secure national security. But look at the economic side. This is a country today which is moving roughly from a 3 trillion minus economy to a 5 trillion plus economy in the next few years. Okay. The last time something like this happened was when it happened in China. Okay. It happened in China, I would say roughly that 3 trillion phrase, correct me if I am wrong, would be around 2006, yes. 2006, 2007. Now just look at what were the demands which came out of China in those 5 years. What were the opportunities which came out of China? What were the new businesses which came out of China in those 5 years? And then factor in that there are now new technologies in play which were not in play in that 2006-2010 period. So I also feel, I mean, at one level it's a complex world, but to be very honest, I feel like a foreign minister who's sort of entering the world arena with some fairly strong cards in my hand. I can sense a much greater global interest in accessing the Indian market, in working with Indian companies. I mean, people, if you look at many of the trade issues we have, economic issues we have them because the rest of the world is today taking up long-term positions in India. These are not, in many cases, positions for today or tomorrow. So they are also figuring out that, look, by 2024, we should be the most populous country, and probably by 2030, if all goes well, we'd be the third largest economy. So they are preparing for all of that. And I need to know that they're preparing for that, and that gives me something there to talk to them about. So, and which therefore brings me back once again to your point, which is therefore integrate the government better, work much more tightly foreign, finance, security, commerce. To me the complexity of the world calls for greater integration of responses.
Thank you.
Sir,
no, we should move.
Yeah. Sir, last question. Sir, the last government, Mr. Modi's government, had built quite a goodwill on the fact that it had reached out to people across the world, Indians who were in different kinds of difficulties. There was a sense that the government was kind, compassionate, caring about people in trouble, Indians in trouble. What level of importance do you give to this aspect going forward, sir?
Enormous, actually. And I'll tell you why. today there is an expectation of an Indian, any Indian, that if they are in trouble anywhere in the world, somewhere the Indian government would do something for them. Okay. Then, sometimes the kind of troubles are not solvable, but often these are, somebody can't get out of a place, somebody's lost a document. Now, in the earlier days, quite honestly, there were two imageries, maybe both unjustified. One, that if you are a connected Indian, it happens. If you are not a connected Indian, it doesn't happen. Okay. The second, that embassies and the places where relief is provided, these are difficult places. You don't naturally go there. You're not sure you're welcome there. I think one of the big changes which has happened, and it's happened both abroad and in India as well, is that sense today that these, in a sense, shall I say, relief service or a response mechanism, this this is available. It's available on call. I think it's done an enormous amount, one, to frankly change the image of the foreign ministry as a ministry which is today grounded, sort of rooted, among in the society. And if I were to sort of look abroad, it's one thing to talk, oh, well, India's influence is growing, our economy is rising, we have greater aspirations. But you have to ask yourself, if all of that is true, then what kind of country are you which doesn't look after its own people? So, to my mind, that effort, or that, I won't even say effort, that obligation to look after your people better comes with greater capability and greater responsibility and frankly greater ambitions. Also means greater care of your people. So I think in the last 5 years, if there's one thing actually, and I was part of the team which helped to change that, and I would give very special credit to my predecessor, Sushma Swaraj here, that she led that effort to change that image, and it required a lot of hard work. You had to create systems which made it happen. It wasn't just something you put out on Twitter. So I'm actually very pleased, and in fact my first tweet actually was to say that, I'm proud to follow in her footsteps, partly because she has that image.
Fantastic. I think that would be wonderful news to the diaspora. Thank you very much, sir. I think we've come to the end of the session. May I request Mr. Claude to please give his summing remarks and word of thanks.
Thank you. I don't think I would be up to the task of summarizing this rich discussion. Let me just try to highlight a few points that you made, Mr. Minister. I think you have been very right in pointing out how these discontinuous changes which are happening are making it much harder to adjust to these changes, and the way the stress under which globalization process has come under in a way is not only highlighting nationalistic forces, but also to some extent creating even more interplay between economics and politics, and making the line between politics and economics on many, many occasions at least thin, if not to say blurred. I think the second point, which is very important that you made, is that today the growing complexity of the issues that we are facing requires, especially in the case of a country like India with its own national strategic interest, its own standing in the world to heighten, it is making the priority of integration more and more important. And as you said rightly, this integration is not just, among ministries and different branches of government, is not just an operational issue. It is a mindset issue. And there, the leadership element becomes really crucial so that this percolates down the bureaucracy and down the implementation of policies and projects. I was, quite frankly, very positively impressed and heartened by your sentence when you said that you felt that as India's chief diplomat, you had very strong cards in your hands. I think it is a very important statement, taking into account, I think, the accuracy of your assessment that the rest of the world, and also with respect to economic strategies and corporate strategies, is taking more and more a long-term approach. And when you look at the long-term approach, indeed, India has very strong cards to play. And this is very heartening for us to hear that and to see the confirmation of that. And so I would like to say that listening to you, I would say that I'm not the only one, and I guess I am reflecting the mood in this room, that the message that you are giving to us is really the kind of message which makes us very hopeful about the future, not only of India as such, but very hopeful about the kind of role that India can play in this very complex, complicated geopolitical landscape. So I would like, on behalf of all of us, to thank you, Mr. Minister, for your message, to thank you for your support to the GrowthNet Summit. It is always not only a pleasure, but truly a kind of food for thought, listening to you and getting back with some of the points that you always so wisely make. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You want us back again? Another picture. Okay. Thank you. Okay.